On today's episode of Wengel's Workshop, I'll be making a mini cleaver. I started with 1/4 inch 1084 stock, and it wasn't quite wide enough for the cleaver I wanted to make, so I decided to forge it out a bit. I forged in the bevel some, and then I used a ball peen hammer to create an even texture on the spine, rather than just leaving it like rough hammered. Now that the steel is wide enough, I can trace out my template and get this thing profiled. I got a little carried away while profiling the knife and went ahead and started grinding the bevels. You can't do this too far though, because you really need a center line mark to make sure that you are grinding to the center. So I didn't go too far, but I was just excited. And as usual, I will finish profiling the knife by grinding the edges parallel to the length of the blade. This just makes it easier to mark out your bevel lines. I have yet to get the small wheel attachments for my grinder, so for the finger choil, I use a multi-tool to grind the inside of that clean. Once that's done, I'll head over to the drill press. I'll put in a couple 1/8 inch pinholes, and then I'll put in a few weight reduction holes. Now the weight reduction holes also allow the epoxy to flow through the knife and connect the scales together to strengthen the scales. Now I use some blue layout fluid to coat the edges and then use a drill bit to mark out where I'm going to grind the bevel lines. Now I'll jump back on my grinder, and using a work rest for some stability, I will start grinding the bevels to the lines that I have marked out. I'll start with an aggressive angle until I get to those lines, and then I'll work my way down the spine. Now the knife's ready for heat treat. With 1084 it's pretty straightforward. I'll do a couple normalization cycles, and then I'll bring it to non-magnetic, hold it for about 5 to 10 minutes, and go ahead and quench it in Parks 50. I'll use a file to ensure that the steel is hardened, and then I will put it in for 2 temper cycles in the oven at 400 degrees for 2 hours apiece. So here's the knife after the heat treatment process is totally finished. I will jump back on the grinder and clean the knife up a bit and finish grinding the bevels. The knife is still pretty beefy since it was 1/4 inch steel, so I decided to add some fullers to the tang to reduce the weight a little bit more. For the scales, I'll be using what I believe is stabilized rosewood, and here I'm drilling the pinholes into the scales. For the finish of the knife, I will be etching it in ferric chloride and then doing a stone wash. Now I'll grind the scales flush with the knife and then get them glued on. Here's the knife after the glue up is finished. I used some black dye in the epoxy to help hide any imperfections where the steel meets the scales. And then I also used copper nails as the pins. They're convenient because they're the right length, plus you can just snip them off and they look really good. Now I'll clean the scales up and grind off any excess epoxy, and then I'll head over to the router table to round over the edges. Now, if you're going to use the router table to round over your edges, please be extremely careful or find another way. With that done, I'll go ahead and hand sand the scales from 150 grit up to 400 grit. Then I'll apply 4 or 5 coats of boiled linseed oil, and then I will polish it with a buffing wheel. So here's where we're at. Now it's time to sharpen the knife. For the secondary bevel, I'll start with a 120 grit belt and I'll create an even burr all the way down the blade on both sides. After I do that, I'll move up to 220 grit and then to 400 grit, and then I'll follow that up with a leather stropping belt that I purchased for the 2x72 that really simplifies the final part of sharpening. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. And if you want to be notified when I upload new videos, hit that notification bell. I would also appreciate it if you jump over on Instagram and follow me over there. As always, thank you for watching.